Hi, this is Paul, and what we have today is a really special. Trying to figure out. Oh, Michael's setting up his stuff. I just muted you, Michael, but I'll let you back in. We have a really special conversation today, following up on the sex talk that we had a couple of days ago with Sam and Laura. And I've asked a group of distinguished and very well-behaved individuals who have different opinions on this. Apparently, usually I see about how many comments you have with certain number of views. For that video, comments way outstretched views. And so this is going to be an interesting conversation today. Some of these people need more introduction than less. Most of them not much, because they've all been on the channel at least once. Some of them have been on live streams a number of times. Kale is still figuring out his tech. Michael was working on his tech. And so we'll see how this goes. Luke, why don't you give a little introduction about yourself?
Okay. I was a fairly early rando. I don't know when I started interacting with Paul. Like most people, I got in on after your initial video about Jordan Peterson. I was heavily involved early, pre-Discord and post-Discord for a while, and I've been less involved recently, but I broadly follow things. I've had long-standing relationships with a lot of people in the community, so I'm around.
I want to know who told you this was going to happen, because I got an email from you unsolicited. Was it Laura or was it Sam?
You guess. Both of them. It was Sam, but Laura probably would have sent me an email too.
See, hierarchy has its privileges. So Luke will definitely have opinions. Laura, you were there for the first one. Anything you want to say to?
I don't know. If anyone watched the first video, they've heard enough of me.
Okay, part of what's interesting about Luke here is Luke was a John Piper disciple, and John Piper desiring God. Luke is from Minneapolis, went to John Piper's church. So I thought, and then he went, of course, Orthodox. And you want to hold up that book that your priest said you should read before participating in this? And did you finish your homework?
No, he just dropped it off this morning, and I've been busy. But unfortunately, it's out of print, and so what are you going to
do? We all need to get the last few copies on 8 books and read it, and then have another discussion probably.
Okay, well, I'm sure we will have follow-up discussions in the future on this. Trip has been a regular on the channel. Trip promised to bring the Puritan thunder into this conversation, because the Puritans got special mention. Trip, why don't you say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. My name's Trip. I've been around for a while, not as long as Luke has on the channel. But Sam also mentioned that maybe this would be a discussion that I'd be interested in. In terms of theology, I did attend Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, and then I also I went to Mars Hill. So Luke and I share a kind of a common young restless Reformed kind of background in that. And I grew up in the Presbyterian Church, and now I'm an Anglican, and very much a Puritan stan. So for sure.
Okay. Thank you, Trip. Moises Pacheco is another Christian Reformed minister besides myself. Moises is planting a church in inner city Chicago, and Moises used to teach sex ed. And Moises is also on CRC Voices, and he often brings thunder on CRC Voices. Why don't you say a little bit about why you want to participate in this, Moises?
Yeah, so about 10 years ago, I worked for a hospital in their community education department, specifically dealing with sex education and diabetes education. I was more the sex education guy of that department. And so I've spoken to thousands of public school students, teachers, administrators about this topic. I've looked at a lot of the relevant studies at that time, because I also spoke to a lot of other educators from different perspectives on sexuality, mostly in the public domain. So not necessarily in the form of theology or the church setting. So trying to navigate my perspective on sexuality, which is rooted in my theological framework, but arguing that without any religious input. So I've been talking about sex for a long time.
All right. And Michael Martin, who I've only had on the channel once. I'm going to be appearing with Michael in Washington, D.C. at the end of July. Michael was also mentioned, sort of brought in by Nate. Nate is probably going to come in when he gets the opportunity. Michael, why don't you?
Well, and I plugged his book in the talk too.
Can you hear
That's
me?
true. That's true. So Michael's struggling with his internet connection. We'll run over to Kale, who was struggling previously. That's why he's lost. Kale's become a regular here on the Friday morning live streams. Kale, do you have any interest in this topic?
A little bit.
Okay. Now Kale feels kind of bad. He's been sort of pegged as the Catholic guy when he says he's really the classic story guy. So we're actually working up a conversation between him and Dr. Jim on stories because they're both really good on stories. So
yeah, I mean, I don't mind being the sort of Catholic guy, but my first interest in love is story, in that direction, not necessarily politics. But anyway, first things first, I just want to say I really enjoyed the conversation with you and Sam and Laura, like really amazing. And I even listened to it twice, if you can believe that. And I loved it because it really got me to think. And so I appreciate that, just first and foremost.
Well, thank you.
Well, Michael's still sorting out his sound. I suspect it's probably a combination of internet and sound. So he'll jump in once he gets that all sorted. Who would like to begin? Who's got some opening comments based on the conversation that they'd like to say something right off the bat? One of the things is there are a number of comments from the Quest for a Spiritual Life conference where people were complaining that there were no Roman Catholics on stage. And so ever since the conference, my stream has been very Roman Catholic heavy. And just given the number of Roman Catholics in the United States and in this conversation, yeah, there's a lot of Catholic influence in this.
Paul, just a quick question. I don't know how much you know about this little corner, like if you have any kind of demographic slice of that, but I mean, how many people in your audience or in this audience, are like me, or Catholic?
I don't have any statistics.
Which your sense?
Google, my sense could be as much as a quarter.
Okay. All right.
At least a quarter who are currently Roman Catholic or grew up Catholic.
Okay.
Michael, you think you got things sorted yet, or how's it going? Like he's still sorting. Okay, I'm gonna put him in the room. Luke, you just popped in. You're always good with a thought. First thoughts on the conversation that you watched of ours.
Man, I sent a bunch of them to Sam and Trip already, and Sarah. We have a little chat, but I thought the conversation was also very wonderful. I guess, I'm definitely a convert to Orthodoxy, so I can't speak to Orthodoxy. And even beginning to read this book, it says, there is no the Orthodox perspective. In the preface, he says something like that, like, I'm going to give, it is in no sense a statement of the Eastern Orthodox position on either sexuality or marriage. It is because the lack of a definitive synthesis of a theology of sexuality within Orthodoxy. But that's just kind of, Orthodoxy doesn't have they're not big on systematics, like the West. That's just not really their thing. And so I can't really speak to that. So I don't have a lot of facts, but I definitely have ideas about all of it. I think it is interesting how I think the context, and from what my priest said, the context of the West is obviously very Augustinian and very stemming out of a response to the sexual milieu of the time in which the fathers were responding in such an extreme way. But my broad understanding is that within Orthodoxy, it wouldn't really be construed as being nearly as sex negative. Okay. But that's, yeah.
Well, Laura, why don't we, probably some people are coming in and they didn't watch the video. Where did this conversation arise, and why? I mean, you and I touched on things before. You and Sam for a while had said we should do a conversation about this. It sounded really good to me. So how did this arise? And
How did it arise?
well, you
For
talked about it
me,
in your Chicago group.
oh, in the Chicago, yeah. Well, I mean, for me personally, it arose out of a sense that Catholics were somewhat lying to ourselves about what our history with regard to attitudes towards sexuality has been, and that we just kind of pretend it's always been what it is now. um, and so that's kind of something I've been chewing on for the past couple years. And then for Sam, it arose out of his study of patristics and his desire to get close to the early church and have more of a feel for what it would have been like in the early church. And then he was just really surprised by what he encountered there, and so he's been chewing on it as well.
Okay. Hello asks, trying to understand what sex positive negative is. I skipped the video with Laura, going to watch it later. Anybody, Laura, you can start here, but anybody else wants to chime in?
My short explanation is that there's this idea that if you're trying to level up in the spiritual life, which everyone should be doing, every time you have sex, you're going to take a few points of damage, if you like D&D metaphors. Whereas the positive current view is, oh, God made sex and he designed it to be in marriage, and even though this is a fallen world, you can still get a lot of good out of it, and it's still conducive to holiness, and it can be really wonderful and something that you can learn useful spiritual lessons from. That wasn't something you heard so much in the olden days. And also, like, maybe a good example is in the old the older sources are all constantly saying sex is permissible in marriage, but it is not for lust, it is for children. Right? It's for procreation. And that's always the juxtaposition. It's not for lust, it's for children. If you listen to people who were brought up in the 20th century or the 21st, they will often say things like sex and marriage isn't for lust, it's for communicating love to another person. But you're not going to hear that before the 20th century from any Catholic source I've ever read. So you're just gonna it's gonna be it's not lust, it's children, you know.
Now I'm going to bring in our Puritan here. Sam mentioned, and I think he had a point, that in many ways the Puritans, ironically, because if someone is puritanical, they're supposedly prudish. But Sam's argument was that, the Puritans really brought this to the fore.
They did. Yeah, and it started with Martin Luther, in terms of this kind of explicit sex positive language. Like Martin Luther was kind of the first one that I'm aware of that ever kind of wrote like, hey, I really like having sex with my wife. Like, and he was that, that blunt about it. Right. So like, it wasn't, but in some ways he's reactionary, obviously, to the, like, going against the monastic lifestyle and vows of celibacy and those kind of things. But he's kind of the first ones, and the Puritans just kind of took that and ran with it in some ways. So we call them prudish, but in a lot of ways, like, compared to their time, they, like, you could see hints of Christian hedonism or something like that in what the Puritans were doing. But one thing that I wanted to bring up is it's not just sex positivity versus negativity that you're going to find a lot of weird stuff in the early church. And I say weird because they were reacting to what was going on at the time. And I think that's one thing that Laura, I talked to Sam about this, but one thing that I wish that you kind of threw a wet blanket on the Gnostic influence a little bit and saying that that's overblown. And I think I think there's truth to that. I think that we do overemphasize the Gnostic influence in a lot of the early church, though, like like that area of the world was very much Hellenized. And so like the Gnostic influence was there, I believe, but they were also reacting to the culture, a Greco-Roman sexual ethic that was really, really libertine. You could do things in the Greco-Roman world that we would look at and be like, oh, that's like, it was all power based. Like, it wasn't even necessarily homosexual, heterosexual, or anything else like that. It's all power. Masters had sex with their slaves. There was, I went to the library at Celsus, and there's literally like a path, like a hidden path between the library of Celsus and the prostitution house across the street, so that you could go in there and then get in. So like this was the world that they're. And then there's like the cults of like Bacchus and Dionysus and that kind of stuff. So like there's a lot of stuff going on in the early church that they're reacting to. And so I think that that's one area that maybe we should talk about is whenever the church is reacting and prescribing things, it's kind of like a doctor. If it's a slight infection, we might go with like, you know, like a lower dosage of antibiotic or something like that. But if what you're going against is something really heavy and could kill you, then you're going to be a little bit more aggressive in your language around it. And I think that we need to read them in light of what they're reacting to, in some ways. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
Yeah, I like that.
I'm going to bring Michael in for his introduction to see if he's got his thing sorted out. Then we'll get Cale in on the classical. Michael, talk to us a little bit about your interest in this. Laura mentioned your book. A little bit of background.
Yes. Well, this is a question I've puzzled about for a long time. And I wrote, and actually, I think when you mentioned the book yesterday, it was talking about my sex positivity in Christianity, and when actually it was marriage positivity that I was starting from. And I did my doctoral work in early modern English literature, and this is in graduate school. I wrote a paper on the way the Song of Songs was interpreted during the late Renaissance, especially in England. And it's amazing that after the introduction of the printing press in England in the late 1400s, I think 150 versions of the Song of Songs came out in publication within 100 years, even less. And it was a regular thing that came out. Now, why is this? Right? Well, and it's kind of funny, the history of the Song of Songs. I mean, it's the only book in the Bible that God isn't mentioned in except for very, very indirectly. And there's nothing about the law. And anybody who would read the Song of Songs and not knowing where it was from would immediately it's a marriage poem. It's an erotic poem. You know, it's a love poem. It's a marriage song, epithalamium. But the history of the church is one of saying that shows how sinful you are. That's not what it's about at all. It's allegory, right? In fact, I have, in honor of you, Paul, the Geneva Bible right here. and the introduction to an excellent song, which was Solomon's. In this song, Solomon, by most sweet and comfortable allegories and parables, describeth the perfect love of Jesus Christ, the true Solomon and King of Peace, etc., right? And it's interesting also, I mean, I grew up going to Catholic school and worked mostly at Catholic colleges through most of my life. And it's interesting that, you know, in Catholicism, the archetype of the family that's presented to boys and girls going to school is the Holy Family, right? The Holy Family, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, right? And here's the thing. If we accept the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary, then that was never a valid marriage, according to Catholic theology, Catholic dogma, right? I mean, so where do we go with this? And it seems to me we have a lot of conflicted messages that are sent. And you were talking about this in the show you did the other day. Now, in my position, after thinking about this long and hard for many years, is that when you have celibates making the rules, it's just like academia. Academia, it does. Academia creates education system in its own image, And so the celibates are creating the system in their own image too. Obviously, celibacy is the way to go, right? And then you go to Mount Athos, and women aren't allowed on the island, and no female animals, and it just gets to be surreal, you know. And so I'm really interested in not excavating the patristic era, because if you think about it, in the patristic era, those are the only reports we have are from the theologians and the bishops. You don't have anything that was from the people on the ground, right? You have interpretation, just like it.
Or the people in the bed.
Pardon me?
Right.
Or the people in the bed.
Do you?
Well, the people on the ground are not the people in the bed.
I see what you're talking about. Yeah.
Dad joke. It's okay. It's okay, Michael.
But even then, yeah. Well, I was going to say, but even then, we don't know what would have said if he was in a very different culture, right?
Right.
In a very different culture. Yeah. Good.
Theory and practice, and I think you can't. I mean, is it not impossible for us to try to interject our own moment, our own selves into that late antiquity? I don't think it works, right? And for me, it's interesting. And you mentioned Luther. I think that it's like the first example of sex positivity in modern Christian history.
Right, and that makes a certain amount of sense, right? I mean, Luther is the first person, whatever his intentions were, to be a church leader and not be celibate, right? So, there's some practical reasons why he would argue for his army, so to speak, to become prolific and fruitful and multiply. There were real political implications for him to preach that message, and I get it. I'm divorcing myself emotionally from the tenets of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. If I were Luther, I would preach the same thing, because you need troops. So I think there's a certain practicality to that, but also I think the reason why Sam says he wanted to kind of go back to get sort of close to the original vision, and then that's a sort of an interesting tendency and framework that is sort of worthy of interrogating as well. And I don't mean to interrogate it to torture it, but just to sort of ask questions about that. Well, why is the original always the best? I don't think it's quite that neat. But to your point, Michael, I think we go back not so as to sort of recreate in some sort of like romantic or nostalgic method of sort of recreating or reprisonating the reality, but rather what is the wisdom in that moment that might help us make sense out of what we're going through right now.
Exactly.
And what I was struck so much, just one more thing, what I was struck so much in listening to Laura and Sam and Paul talk originally is that Sam kept talking about the what did he call it? Was the original church, or what was the phrase he used?
Oh, I don't remember.
Going back to the ancient church, or the but like, which one are you talking about, right? And I don't mean like Corinth or Philippi, or I don't mean it that way, but what it seems to me when I read the New Testament, that they very much thought that the return was imminent. Right, that Jesus was going to return, right? And so, like, I imagine, sort of putting myself into that headspace. If I thought that the apocalypse was coming like soon-ish, like now-ish, I'm not so sure I would recommend anybody like setting up shop and creating a home, right? I know, like, if we all know that like having a family is going to be problematic if all hell is going to break loose, right? And so I think as soon as it became apparent that they were going to have to sort of hunker down and create communities that would extend both in space and in time. Yeah. I think that opens way complicates the issue in real ways, so that the arguments, well, it's better to be celibate, I think are kind of those are sort of very specific time and place arguments. And as soon as you realize you're going to have a wife and family, and you're going to be generations into this thing, I think it changes the whole ball.
I thought about that too when listening to the conversation.
I want to make sure Michael can land the plane, and then I'm going to get Moises in.
No, I think you're exactly right, Cale. In fact, you made a point that Martin Heidegger makes in his lectures on St. Paul. I can't remember what the name of the book is, but he talks about, in his opinion, I think he's right. 2 Thessalonians was written first, and 1 Thessalonians written second.
Yeah.
And because in 2 Thessalonians there's a much more of an anxiety about the second coming really quickly.
Yeah.
And so in Corinthians, when he says it's better, to marry than to burn, this is a guy who thinks it's going to happen pretty soon, right?
Yeah.
And it didn't happen pretty soon.
Right.
At least not in the way he thought, right? And I think, like you said, Cale, that changes everything. And then I think, what we have then is almost in a 2,000-year mistake about context.
Yeah.
That's what I think when being a eunuch for Christ, right? When I see that the history of the church, and we don't even know what the church is, by the way. The history of Christianity. I think you start with a category mistake, and it never gets rectified. And I think you guys talked about it the other day. Laura, I think you were talking about it with John Paul II with the theology of the body. I think he was trying to issue a long overdue corrective to that really damaging anthropology.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I think when we were talking about Freud the other day too, and Freud, the reason he came to those conclusions wasn't just out of his head. He was actually talking to patients and realizing how much, a misinterpretation of Christian religion, sexual ethics screwed a whole bunch of people up.
That's right.
Right.
All right.
And resolved.
I'm going to bring Moises in, and then I think I'm going to try and have some order we got a big group, and we're going to have to sort of work through this thing. So Moises, your opening comments?
So there were a couple things. One, I totally agree with Cale and Mike about the context and the return of Christ being imminent, being a factor in, do we just disregard Genesis 2? That God created man and woman and said, for this reason, a man shall leave
and multiply.
So that's something way from the beginning that God ordained and initiated. And I believe the context of the early fathers was part of the reason why they're like, okay, we don't need that anymore. But I do believe that there's a really important part of that Genesis narrative, and that, God creates woman from the rib of Adam. And then after that, Adam says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And says, therefore, a man shall leave his father's household and cleave to his wife. And so there's this idea, that was mentioned in the last video of sex having two purposes. One, reproduction. True. But what happens if you can't reproduce? Well, then there's the idea of intimacy. But I think we too often try to connect intimacy with sex. Like sex is the intimacy.
Correct.
But the intimacy is the knowledge of the other. And sexuality can be one way towards that intimacy, but it is one way. There are many other ways towards that intimacy. And it's not just intimacy with another person, because then you open the door for homosexual marriage and all kinds of other things. But it is intimacy with our rib, with a part of ourself, with the part of ourself that's not in us anymore. For me as a man, I'm intimate with my wife because she's female. She sees the whole world another way, and we have become one, so that both our perspectives, our outlooks on life are one. And what the evangelical church has done with that intimacy and sexuality is, well, then it's okay to be a pervert as long as you're only a pervert with your wife.
Right.
And that's kind of the opposite approach to sexuality, is I'm not using my wife for some kind of self-pleasure. What I'm doing is I'm becoming intimate with my wife in a certain form. I'm trying to a certain degree, understand her. And in so much understanding her, understanding the part of myself that's missing, and understanding what God has revealed through that, if that makes sense.
Okay, I want Cale to talk a little bit about the classical period, and then let's ask the question, is the Bible sex positive or sex negative? So I don't know, Cale, did you want to say something about the classical period?
Well, I guess, everybody's heard this sort of stuff, right? Especially this little corner. I think Holland's point remains, important, and it's already brought up. But I think that the classical world, the context out of which the church springs is sex saturated in such a way that we don't understand. We in a weird way have lost the connection between freedom and chastity, right? So that you read some of the ancient things, even stuff all the way up to and including the Middle Ages, which is really where I think the conversation kind of skipped over. No offense, but that the idea of being chaste, of choosing to be chaste as an exercise of one's agency and autonomy, so that, to use Sam's language, to kind of level up spiritually, or Laura, I think you talked about that too, that is a sort of an overlooked point. And so we, in our moment right now, cannot even imagine that there's such a thing as a kind of liberatory move that does not involve sort of, genital chaos, right?
Right.
That we just, unless I can have sex with abandon, or what is this Christian hedonism thing that y'all were talking about, then therefore it's like you're somehow being unfree. And I think that is a weird inversion, that we are blinded by our own eye rolling about the alleged sex negativity of the ancient church.
I need to defend John Piper quickly, because I'm not a Piperite anymore, but how everyone is talking about Christian hedonism isn't Christian hedonism.
Okay,
So,
I'm really more talking about the kind of Laura, you read the blurb on the Catholic book. I'm talking about this sort of 21st century, like, hold off until marriage, but as soon as marriage happens, it's all, what is it, like champagne and bounce music or something. It's like
fireworks.
Yeah. So anyway, that's really more what I'm talking about, Luke. So I don't mean to straw man Piper.
No.
I
Yeah, I don't know if it's Piper,
No, I know.
but like that's definitely the impression that you get from like the I Kiss dating goodbye type
Right.
stuff.
Well,
Right. That was there. Yeah,
and certainly
for sure.
part of the youth pastorish movement in the Catholic Church has sort of definitely tacked that way in the wake of theology of the body. I think it's a little bit of a cartoonish version of the John Paul II's theology of the body, but that's basically the move, right? The move is to sort of embrace sex positivity and as if it's real. But anyway,
Don't you think some of this is an absolutizing of sex and conflating it with eros? Sex is not eros.
right.
Like eros is an absolute. Sex is not.
All right. Anything else about?
No.
So is the Bible sex positive, sex
I have to think
negative?
about that, Luke.
Well, the whole Bible, that's a big question, right?
Yeah,
So
Well, you've got
Genesis is. I mean, look, God is absolutely obsessed with generation in the book we call Genesis. I mean, it's all about fruit, right? And that's the whole point. It's like, have as many babies as possible. Like, God is absolutely obsessed with this, and I don't think that's an unavoidable. If you're gonna take the Old Testament as sort of part of the show here, and I think most of us do, you can't avoid the fact that God is obsessed with sex.
yeah, I think the
Yes.
Old Testament is very positive about marriage and childbearing, and there's not much there doesn't seem to be much anxiety about whether your internal disposition while you're doing it is good or not.
Right.
So I think
Onan gets
there
in
is
trouble.
Yeah.
Onan gets in trouble.
Yes, but he took an action.
No,
it wasn't
but
it wasn't
that's because
about
I think
it wasn't about
that's a
his
misread. Yeah.
Well,
Sorry,
yeah,
Laura.
I mean that
Go
story
ahead.
happens in a context, and what he did wrong was that he did a certain action for a certain reason. But it's not this like the Christian tradition is full of people.
But
It's full of anxiety about your own motives and your whether you're being selfish or all this kind of stuff. Like, I just don't see that level of anxiety in the Old Testament. It's more like if you're married and you're making babies, you're doing the right thing, and you're not maybe doing so much self-analysis. You know what I mean?
For sure.
Yeah.
But Onan got in trouble because he was rejecting the mandate for fertility.
Right.
For
And getting the enjoyment without the fertility.
But it's also
Right. Well, but he was
That's-
also obligated to provide
right.
his
Trip.
brother.
It's a covenantal dodge.
And God's not
Yes,
obsessed
exactly.
with sex. God's obsessed with fertility and fecundity.
Eros.
I mean,
Eros.
we're talking about a people in the desert, right?
Yeah,
Be
I'm not
fruitful and
knocking
multiply,
God.
to the ground that was almost impossible to. I'm a farmer. Almost impossible to grow anything out of the land of milk and honey, right? So that's the miracle in a way. Is how do you take this barren wasteland and make it fruitful, right? that's a theme throughout both the Old Testament and the New Testament, especially with barren mothers, right? With Sarah, and then with Elizabeth, right? And then who are blessed with fertility late in the game, right?
Yeah.
Those are important things, and that's why, like I said, I was not writing sex positivity in my book, but marriage positivity, because marriage is an image of the covenant, right?
And I think that's an important distinction: marriage positivity versus, because we keep trying to separate, like isolate sex and sexuality out of marriage, and then, well, what purposes can we derive outside of marriage? Well, I don't think you can derive anything useful. But within marriage, well, now you have boundaries. Okay, and what is the purpose within marriage? It is not the entirety of the marriage. It is an aspect of a marriage. Like I always think Joni Eareckson Tada. You know, what's her marriage like? Is it completely disastrous because of her disability? I would not say so, or at least I would imagine her and her husband are fulfilled in other ways and have other ways of forming intimacy and knowing each other. And so, yeah, I think marriage positivity is the important aspect.
So one thing from this book that I just started reading in the preface is he characterizes the difference between kind of deontological ethics and teleological ethics. And I think that's kind of the difference between sex and knowing your place in the story, Old Testament, New Testament, Paul and 1 Corinthians, because I think in spiritual bodies someday, like St. Paul says, knowledge will pass away. I think sex will pass away. We're not going to be having sex for forever. And so I think it's knowing your place in the story. I think right now, as biological, physical bodies, we're meant to be having sex. That's part of the procreative act now. And maybe there are people who are called to live kind of eternally outside of this time in a teleological way as monastics, pointing to this future thing. But that's an exceptional thing, not the rule. It can't be the rule. We have to procreate.
Now, interesting, a couple of weeks ago on my podcast, we interviewed Martin Shaw, who's a recent convert to the Orthodox Church. And one of the things we were talking about there, and I talk about this in my book, Sophia in Exile, is what would is a phenomenological Christianity possible? I mean, can you discover it in the world as we are, right? And my position is that it is discoverable, and I think that's what's basically sophiology is that dimension of discoverability of, and a lot of it has eros written all over it, and not sex, right? The attraction is very platonic in that way, but where. So if that's possible, it can, and this is the thing I missed in your discussion the other day, is there was a lot of theory, there's a lot of historicity, but nobody actually said anything about experience, or why does it feel so good, or those kinds of things, or does it work as a kind of drawing together of persons?
Yeah.
Right. Nobody talks about
experience. Let me get. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm definitely not going to talk about my personal experience, partly because my husband is a very private person, and partly because I'm a school teacher, so I feel like that'd be really stupid.
Stories, but I do mean, in our own experience. I mean, I don't want to hear your experiences. It's private, right? In our own experience, it does something. I remember I was thinking about this. You guys reminded me. There was a comedy show I saw on cable. Gosh. Maybe before I even had kids, so more than 30 years ago. And there was this comedian, he's talking about God creating human beings. And he's talking, let's do the brain, Gabriel. Let's do the heart. Now let's do the sexual organs. Give me some more of them sensitive nerve endings, Gabriel. Why is that, sir? I want to hear him call my name. Right? Which I think it stayed with me for a long time, but I think there's some
truth to that.
Truth disclosed there, right?
Well, I mean, not to be crass, but it's like you have to enjoy sex for it to work as a man. I mean, sorry, it's not. Some part of you's enjoying it, or it's not happening.
I think that's an important distinction as well. some part of you. It's not always a fullness of enjoyment.
Sure.
But I did.
Hopefully you should be integrated.
That I found interesting was he was like, Christianity, can you discover it in another way? And to a certain degree, some of my sexual ethic was kind of formed that way, because I feel like everything I learned through the EV Free Church about sexual ethics was kind of misguided a little bit. But what really did form me was the amount of sexual abuse in my family, especially endured through females. I mean, if you look through the Puerto Rican family trees, there's all kinds of weird stuff there. But my family was very open about talking about that stuff. So very young, I came to discover that a lot of men have treated a lot of women poorly. And to the point that even my high school girlfriend had been raped, not by me, by somebody else. But I also saw the effects that it had on her. And I kept having to ask myself, let's say I married her or somebody else. How do I know I'm not reinforcing some kind of damage that was done to them? Yeah. And so it made me very careful as I approached any kind of sexual relationship. Even when I got married, I was very careful as to not trying to satisfy my own appetites.
Right.
But how do I get to know this person in an intimate way to the point where that extreme act of intimacy, I'm welcoming it, so to speak, and not satisfying my own urges.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, Moises, because, if I know in this corner we have talked a lot about, and people have talked about, the sort of the evolutionary sort of substrate of we're animals, right? But we're sort of between the angels and the animals, right? We're in sort of this middle space, and we are, just like we have certain sort of propensities to mine for sugar and mine for fat, right? From a sort of a biological standpoint, I think we have the same sort of propensity to mine for pleasure as being a kind of mechanism by which copulation happens, right? And we know that the more copulation happens, more babies happen, right? So there's sort of this biology level, but we know that it's about kind of transcending mere appetite, right? So that I'm struck by your conversation about the women in your family tree, right? But I know Brett often talks about this sort of like these two strategies, right? For sex, right? One is sort of to have as much and widespread as possible, independent of feeling, and then there's the sort of the mate up and partner up and maintain with a female for the duration. You have these sort of two models, and unfortunately both of them kind of work on the biological level, right? And so we are, I think, constantly in this sort of tension. How do we overcome this sort of the strictly biological, the sort of the fallen biological? And to me, this invariably brings up sort of two-speedism that Paul invoked. And I know you don't like to go down that path, Paul, but I do think that just like Jordan Peterson has preached for now years that hierarchy is inevitable, I think that two-speedism and three-speedism and four-speedism is inevitable. And I think we just have to sort of face that head on. And therefore, what is the wisdom that we can mine in the clear sort of sex negativity of our tradition? All of our traditions, I think we have to be asked.
Speaking of this different speeds, I think you go through Christian history, and there were different speeds of this. I mean, I think even pre-Christian, the Song of Songs. I mean, why is that included in the canon of the Bible in the first place?
Because it's special.
Right? It is special, and
we don't. And all of us don't get it, right?
No. Yeah, but then you go forward in history. I mean, you get to the in the Middle Ages, the time of the troubadours, right, where they used poetry, and just like Solomon does in the song, they use poetry to I wouldn't say civilize the sex, but to elevate it and to bring it something closer to the sacred.
Right. It's to both signal and create. It sort of does double work. I
don't know if Cale, if you talk to your students about this. I think you teach high school, right?
I do, yeah.
Because I talk to, when I teach romanticism, for instance, I'll talk to the students about when I was, what a goofy kid I was, and I just thought I couldn't just have a girl; I had to earn her. I'm going to write poetry.
Right.
And I was in 6th grade, and I wrote a whole book of poetry for Carrie Messenschlager in my class. And 10 years later, I was 22. I was at a baseball game with my girlfriend. She said, Mike, and I bumped into Carrie, and she said, I still have that book you wrote me. I was like, I put a bag right over my head.
Yeah.
But,
That's so good. That's so good.
people don't have,
Dean.
right? And I mentioned this to students now, and they're like, yeah, that's never going to happen.
Well, in my experience, when I'm talking to my kids about, like for instance, I teach Romeo and Juliet in the freshman year, and what is so remarkable to me is that so few of my students believe in love. Like love is just off the table. It's not real. It is, you know, right. the contractual spirit has descended upon the kids, and they just do not see it either as an ideal or even certainly not possible, and probably not even as an ideal.
And that's at 14 years old, right?
Yeah. The 14.
Does the New Testament change the conversation on this from the
Absolutely.
Old?
Yes.
Say more, Laura.
I mean, I think it just obviously does, doesn't it? Does anyone think it doesn't?
No, I kind of don't think it does. I mean, because a lot of the Old Testament is narrative, so we're reading in the Old Testament about things that happened. But I don't think of anything in the New Testament going against what I read in Genesis 2.
Oh yeah, no, I don't think it's like an argument against Genesis 2 or an argument against marriage being good or anything. But it adds elements to the conversation, and you can tell because people took some things from it and ran with them the way they did.
Because I think our Jewish, like the Jewish friends in our community, like Yosef, I've been talking to Yosef about this, and Chezi, and they would say, I mean, they see Judaism as being very sex positive, and so the negative aspects of the New Testament where it went sex negative, they would not resonate with at all, and I wouldn't either. I think those were wrong.
No, I think Laura was talking about how sex changes with the New Testament. I think it changes with Paul by that misapplication of what Paul says.
Yes.
But I think,
sure,
the first miracle performed in John is at a wedding, right? Yeah. And that's it. And I always tell my own children, I said, the Bible starts with the wedding, the miracles start with the wedding, and the Bible ends with the wedding.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So don't ever forget that. And but I think, like I said before, we're just dealing with 2,000 years of getting it wrong.
Well, I'm not ready to go there, Michael. I don't think it's 2,000 years of getting it wrong. I think it's 2,000 years of trying to figure out the balance of costs. I think that I ask myself the question when listening to Laura and Sam talk with Paul the other day. I kept asking myself the question, what is obvious to me, and I'm putting obvious in scare quotes, what is obvious to me, Cale Zeldin in 2023, must be a blind spot that I'm not looking at clearly. So for them, let's say our forebears in the ancient church, right? They're I think from my vantage point, sex negative, basically, that for them it was obvious. It's like, of course, this is like this super mega powerful thing that is going, can uncork all kinds of chaos and damage. Like it's absurd not to think it is. So therefore, what am I missing there? Like there's got to be some wisdom there. I'm not saying we have to recreate it exactly, but there's got to be some wisdom there that I think Moises, you may have hit on a little bit, but go ahead, Laura.
Well, that's kind of how I feel too. It's definitely not that I would want to recreate the past, and I understand that some of it was stupid and that also it created a lot of human misery. So, but I think people were working something out over all those years that we can learn, and we can distill some wisdom from some of it.
And Laura,
so that's why I wanted to go back to, like, I think something that maybe you or Michael were talking about was, is there a danger in trying to, let's get so close to the early church, like take the canon out of it. Let's get so close to the early church that we know what they thought about everything. And then that's the most faithful representation of Christianity. Is that true? Do we believe that?
I'm Catholic, so I'm okay with being in time and allowing things to develop and roll out over time. So no, I don't feel like I have to pretend to live in.
The councils, right? I mean, you have to face the councils. The councils rise because they're trying to work something out that wasn't clear, Like that, so I don't want to go back to like the maybe Sam would get mad at us here, but I don't want to go back pre-Nicaea to sort of rehash problems that I feel like Nicaea has sort of risen up to address, right? It's like,
I completely agree, which is why I think that going back to Origen or some of these guys and being like, well, this is what all the early church fathers were writing is a problem, because they're writing in a context and they cannot apply what they're seeing to all times and all spaces and everything else. And it's a problem to do. And even if we're going to go back to like Augustine or someone like that, like Augustine wrote literally that, like if you do what he called like unnatural acts with your wife. Right. We'll just leave that, to the imagination. But he said it would be better for a man to be unfaithful to his wife and have a natural sexual relation than do an unnatural thing with his wife. So he was saying commit adultery if you're going to do this other kind of sexual act. And when we read Augustine, we can't just say, oh, well, this is what the early church thought. I was like, I think we'd be really uncomfortable with a lot of the things that he's saying.
Right. Because remember, marriage is a covenant, right? And so that's why I think it's important, y'all. We've invoked marriage, or Michael, I think you talked about marriage centric as opposed to just necessarily sex centric. Marriage is a covenant, and part of at least the Catholic theology that I sort of grew up with in both, is the sense that part of my job is to help my wife achieve blessedness. Part of my wife's job is to help me, become holy. And so therefore, your wife is not, in that Augustine model that you just brought up, Trip, like your wife is sacred to you. So the fact that you would defame or profane is probably a better word, that you would profane that which has been gifted to you and is a sacred person is really important. And therefore, the idea that, again, this is another problem I have with sort of the rampant sex positivity of our time, is that it's as if, young guys are told, and I think Sam brought this up in his conversation, that, once you get married, you can have all the wild sex you want. It's like, wait a second. There's another person involved here, and it's called your wife. And, maybe she's not down for this today or now or ever. And like, maybe there should be some negotiation.
Why is it always the dude who wants the stuff? I mean, what if the wife?
No, that's fine.
Let's be fair.
But
Paul's right there. But in my experience, many of the women that are like that want those things have been sexually abused. And that was the scariest part for me, as when I would have women come on to me, which isn't a regular thing. So,
come on, Moises.
I don't know though, but when we go across the street from the library to that bar, there's always that lady.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder. But there's an aspect of it now where, like, if you go back 50 years and you tell a young man 50 years ago, once you get married, you can do whatever you want. What he wants is going to be very different from a young man today. And so, I mean, because you introduced the idea.
I'm not arguing for the unnatural acts, whatever we want to categorize. I'm not saying that that's a good thing. What I'm saying is Augustine said it would be better for you to have conventional sex.
Go to the prostitute with that stuff instead of your wife.
Well, I get it, but there's also
wife. And I think no one here would say, yeah, fine. If you really need to go to the prostitute, that's better. We would all be like, no, don't like that's not.
Don't break the commandment, okay?
Yes, exactly. And so, like Augustine.
So there's a rhetoric to that.
Stuff out.
Well, right. So Trip, there's a rhetoric to that, right? It's like,
and I don't even want to.
He's not saying, hey, go to the prostitute. He's saying it would be better. Like neither of these are on the table. You're Augustine.
For sure. He's not saying either of them are okay. Right. He's saying one is better than the other. And I don't think any of us would say it's better. We would say he's highlighting the evil of what you could do even within a marriage and via sex. And so
But don't you think some of this even
Michael wanted to get in here. He's gonna bust.
No, I mean, my second youngest son's middle name is Augustine.
But
sorry.
Hey, that's your fault, Michael. I'm sorry.
But
some of my best friends
identify with him as a professor of rhetoric, right? But I mean, this is a guy who kicked his common law wife to the curb so he can get holy, right? I mean, I imagine if I were his spiritual advisor, I'd say you better not do that. You can't do that. But he did it anyway, right? And I think, didn't you think about what happened to that poor woman?
Every time I read the Confessions, I think about
Doesn't
it.
matter. He did it for holiness.
Or his son. Because he had
That's
that's
right.
his only son.
I can't remember where I read this, but I thought that he still supported her.
I did too, Trip. I heard this. I read the same thing.
I think that I read that he did still support her financially, and he that's all I know. I mean, I just read that, and I can't remember where I read it. So
I'm going to have to go in a second, but the more we're talking about this, I really do think a lot of this is about deontological ethics and teleological ethics. Most of our conversation is centered around deontological ethics and morality rather than becoming holy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, in this conversation so far, I think we can all agree the Bible is and Christianity is marriage positive. Okay.
Yeah.
And procreation positive. But the two things that we haven't talked about is Jesus and Paul, both single guys to the best of our knowledge. Little unusual in the Jewish context.
Jesus wasn't single. Jesus is married to the church.
Oh, well.
Yes, which is why Michael had to bring up the one thing that I strongly disagree with them on, which is Mary's perpetual virginity. I think it's metaphysically necessary to completely break hierarchy, and the notion that Mary is the archetype of the church is completely destroyed if that's not the case. But don't make the anarchists defend hierarchy, man.
I know, Nate. This is fantastic.
Can she have integrity and not be a physicalist virgin?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't mind if she is or not, but the thing is, that's a horrible example to hold up to Christian families.
Right. Actually, the one thing,
guys. Oh, thanks.
Trip was saying something earlier that I thought was really getting to the point, because the other thing that I would like to interject into this is to acknowledge the fact that romantic love is an invention of Christian culture. And when Tripp was talking about how sexuality was viewed in the ancient world and how it was all about power and property, really power and property is what it was about in the ancient world. Romantic love, it's like only a Christian culture gives us Dante and the troubadours. And so 100%. So that's the other thing that I would like to see us talk about.
I would love to talk about that. There wasn't time to cover it in the conversation we had.
I get that you guys can't cover all of
no, of course not.
2,000 years.
Be better, Laura.
Conversation, but
I've got 15 or 20 more minutes I can be on here if anyone wants to talk about that. Go for it.
I mean, I wrote down a bunch of quotes from so you guys quoted John Chrysostom, but he was describing the sexual ethics in the 4th and early 5th centuries, talking about how Roman laws allow dealers to enslave children and to train them in sexual specialties for sale as prostitutes. This is what the early church was reacting to. And we have to be very aware of that whenever we're reading. They're like, hey, rein this shit in. Right. That's a really important context that they're not
very
dealing
similar
with
to our
us.
context.
Yeah,
exactly.
My
response to that is look at our context right now. Do we have to take?
Well, no, we have a different problem, right? Because now we've got porn everywhere. People aren't getting married. We're having sex but not having children. And those kind of things. Our fertility rate is plummeting. So do we really think that John Chrysostom or Irenaeus or whatever, would they really be worried about people having sex and having pleasure within the context of a monogamous marriage, or would their attention be focused somewhere else? And I think the answer is obvious.
I might disagree with that a little bit because, top 3 reasons marriages fall apart: in-laws, money, and sex. And marriage is falling apart because of sex right now, because of lack of pleasure or misunderstanding of that, is a significant and huge problem in our current context. So if I was a founding father, which I'm not, I might write something about that. Why are husbands seeking pleasure and only seeking sexual pleasure through their wives?
Maybe, but people are also putting off sex for much longer, and putting off young people are having sex way less than they ever have in terms of when we're polling. People are getting married way later.
That also depends on where you're polling too, because in poor communities, that's not the case.
I'm talking about in America, and it's
I live in America too, and here it's not the case, and that's the tricky part. Is a lot of it we're dealing with studies or things that apply themselves towards a certain socioeconomic status. And the ones really suffering the consequences are those, even in America, at the rural and poor urban
Yeah, right. This, I mean, but and to this point, if you recall, in one of the sections of Louise Perry's book, she talks about, that post-sexual revolution, women don't have any leg to stand on to say no, right?
Right.
And I thought that was a really powerful part of the conversation. Anyway, I lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Well, Gregory of Tours' inspiring story was that a man and a woman get married because their parents set them up, but the woman didn't really want to get married. She wanted to save her body for Christ, and she tells her husband that, and his response is, "Okay, we'll do that." Which is quite amazing. Quite amazing.
Yeah,
in the
I mean,
context
yeah,
of
no.
it.
So there's another book by Peter Brown where he says, and I just wrote it down. Men own the bodies of their in this Roman world. Men own the bodies of their male and female servants within the walls of a great rambling house filled with young servants over whom the master ruled supreme. Fidelity to one's wife remained a personal option, despite harsh laws punishing women. Married women for adultery, infidelity by their husbands incurred no legal punishment and very little moral disappropriation. That's the world that the early church was dealing with. And that's
I have to say, with the example Laura just gave in the
Gregory of Tours,
Life of the Saints, there are so many examples of that same story where a couple gets married and the woman or the husband, usually the woman, wants to be dedicated to Christ, and so they vow to live in celibacy or die. And well, that's the story, right? But it's also rhetoric. It's also propaganda, right? It's selling a message. This when the whoever the writers were, or whether they were the fathers or later medieval writers, there was an agenda, right? And this was not coming from, like I said before, from as Paul said, from the bed up, from the ground up. It's not coming from the laity. This is coming from the hierarchy.
But again,
and
this very
model that they were and this is now, I don't know about you. I think I'm a little bit older than most of you. I don't know about, but when I was a kid going to Catholic school, the take home, even though it was not explicit, but the implicit take home was that, the highest calling is the priesthood.
Michael, what year did you graduate high school? What year did you graduate? Do you mind asking what year did you graduate high school?
1980.
Okay.
So the take home, the message was the priesthood or religious life is the highest calling. But if you can't do that, marriage is okay too.
Right.
And that was
certainly the world my mom grew up in. That was certainly not the world I grew up in.
But if you were trying to subvert, especially within Christian communities, if you're trying to subvert or even convert women to Christianity, and they were being abused in the ways that they would have been abused in the early Christian church, this would be a way of saying, hey, Christians don't behave this way. They don't consider your bodies this way. There's a higher calling that you can have. And these stories would stick out, even if they're true, like whether or not they're made up or they're propaganda or whatever, like even if they're true, they would stick out and those stories would be told. So
I guess propaganda is a very
what you negatively
valenced word. I mean, is Marvel, is Endgame true?
So here's a question.
Propaganda?
Should Christians aspire to sexual pleasure and bliss in the context of marriage? Because we're talking about aspirations here, and we're talking about propaganda, and we're talking about hierarchies, and one of the tensions in Christianity very much is the single life better? Is the married life better? And of course, Paul says, well, if you got this weakness, then marriage. So and Michael wanted to bring it back into the phenomenological. Are we to aspire to sexual pleasure?
Yeah. Okay. So let's tie that with an earlier question that I don't think we ever answered, Paul, is the Bible sex positive? I think that we just kind of rambled around it, but maybe let's go around and everyone give their answer alongside that one. Is the Bible sex positive, and is sexual pleasure / bliss something a Christian should aspire to? Like, let's just go around and let's all like give our takes on that, because I don't think we ever answered that question that you asked.
A rare moment of silence in this group.
I would go back to when I first jumped into the conversation. I would go back to what I was talking about, which is like this Christian development of romantic love. Because to just keep it at the level of sex isn't to you're not making it Christian yet. So it has to be. So it has to go a level up from that. It's like just talking about it in terms of sex is not enough. But so romantic love which is a Christian development, is actually the ideal. But not every. But here's the thing, though:
is romantic love better if it's sexless? Chivalry.
No, but medieval
chivalry
love
is actually
isn't
about
sexless.
it's actually about the knight. It's about the knight balancing the masculine and feminine within himself. It's about alchemical marriage. It's not really. But here's the thing. Here's my concern, and Laura and I just want to say this really quickly. My concern is like we don't want to. There are people who are not going to have that available to them. So we don't want to get to the point where we start talking really negatively about celibacy either, because celibacy still remains a legitimate option within a Christian context. But what I want to get away from is,
but it's only legitimate.
arguing about which is higher. There are two different paths that are equally valid and are right for different people.
I would say.
She's had her hand up. You got to get.
Sorry, I was going to say something before, but now I want to respond to what Nate just said, which is that I feel like the answer to that problem is to take yourself lightly, right? Like most Catholics know that G.K. Chesterton quote that angels can fly because they take themselves lightly, right? And there are different callings in life, and there are different things you may be called upon to do for various reasons, and you need to take yourself and your desires rather lightly in order for that to be fruitful, right? So there's a way of doing asceticism where you're all Sturm und Drang about it and you're taking yourself so seriously, and whether or not you fulfill your desires is just like such a tragedy or whatever.
Yep.
And then there's a way where you're able to do it with more of a perspective on what a little thing you are and how great God is, and how what a relationship with God means, and that if you have one, all the other stuff it matters in a sense, but there's a sense in which it doesn't really matter what you're being asked to do. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, it does. And I also I think the other thing I would want to add to what I was saying earlier is that even the same person in a different season of life might have a different calling. There's something weird about our culture, like hypersexualizing everybody through every stage of life. Yeah. Like the idea of like trying to have sexy 70-somethings is just creepy and weird.
Right.
There's something really disordered about that.
Or talking about gender sexuality with a 4-year-old.
Right.
Is like a completely insane thing. Yeah.
No. Did we ever answer were we asking with the Bible or the church is sex positive?
Yeah, sorry, we got away from Tripp's question.
Well, I guess it's Paul's question. I'm just trying to tie them together. So, is the Bible sex positive, like the canon? We'll stick with the canon. We'll ignore. And,
I'll read a line from Scripture, and you tell me if it's sex positive or not.
Okay, go for it.
You ready? I am a rose of the field and a lily of the valley. Like a lily among the thorns, so is my love among the daughters. Like the apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my well-beloved among the sons of men. Under his shadow had I delight, and sat down, and his fruit was sweet unto my mouth. Positive or negative?
Well, that was about how much Christ loved the church.
I wanted to point that out originally when you were bringing up Song of Solomon about it being allegory. The allegory only makes sense if sex is positive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
the allegory totally falls apart.
Yeah, then you're like, well, what is God doing here if that's a negative thing, right?
Well,
if there's no like human equivalent, it's kind of like Hosea. Like the allegory between Hosea and the prostitute wife and Israel being unfaithful to God, that only makes sense if actually an unfaithful wife is a bad thing. If an unfaithful wife is not a bad thing, then what is God even saying here? So yes,
Well,
it's
this-
allegory. Of course, it's not like literally a husband writing to his wife, but the allegory only makes sense if the Bible is sex positive.
But here's a little aside, which is really important as far as the Reformation goes. So with both John Milton, and Edmund Spencer, there's a move where they do it. And Stanley Fish wrote a book about this called "Surprised by Sin," where they'll use this kind of language to draw you in to, using some kind of, beautiful imagery of a woman, for instance. And then they'll come in with aha, see how sinful you are. You thought that was beautiful. You thought that you were excited about that one. How dare you? Right? Which is basically, that was the MO of most, going back to at least the Middle Age, and even earlier than the Middle Ages, and going back to Origen, I think, with interpretations of the Song of Songs, right? They wouldn't let the laity read it because they wouldn't read it as an allegory.
Right.
So why? Right. I mean, I want us to really ask the question: what were they scared of? Like, I don't want to straw man this. I don't want to turn everybody into sort of like super prudes until 1930 and we finally legalized contraception. Like, why?
No, I would honestly, like, it's a very sensual set. I mean, if I'm going to, if I would have some qualms maybe about a woman getting up and reading some of those kind of verses in a church.
Well, you're already behind the curve, because that would have been allowed anyway. But again, why?
That's true. But the reason why I wouldn't.
No, I mean, I'm really serious.
I would have qualms is actually because, like, hearing a woman express sexual desire verbally and describe those things as being pleasurable might actually make men think of her that way. That aren't her husband. And it's not crazy to me being like, there's some things that maybe you should read, a man should read, or you should read in your home. That's not proper to give to a 17-year-old and put her up there on stage and have her read. Yes, like I don't know why this is controversial, but it's not to me. I think it's very obvious.
Like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, his book of commentary on the Song of Songs is like 500 pages on a 5-page book. And that was the most popular book read in the monasteries and in the convents during the Middle Ages.
Right, because what are you sacrificing? Right. I mean, I think, again, I want to really resist the urge to make fun of all these like stodgy old people. Right. I mean, that they clearly saw in it. I mean, if I'm a celibate monk, I think that sacrifice is real. Right now, that doesn't mean that we married folk don't have our own sacrifices. We all know that there's ample sacrifice there. My personal belief is that the pill has been has allowed us to pretend that there aren't costs and that there aren't sacrifices, which I think is the real evil of the pill. Sorry, I'm just going to say it. But that's maybe for a different time. But anyway, what am I sacrificing? And why am I sacrificing it for? Well, the hieros gamos, right? We, the church, gets to marry God, and like that's quite something to forsake in the now for the ultimate in the future, in the future eternal.
I think that's one of the most important points, Cale, is the sacrifice.
Yeah.
In both pathways. If I'm going to be celibate, I'm sacrificing something.
Yes.
If I'm
we're called
married, I'm laying down my life. I'm sacrificing everything for my wife or the church. They're kind of the same thing in my opinion.
Right, correct.
Forsaking all others.
Well, we forget, right? That chastity, at least the way that I've been taught chastity in the Catholic context, is that chastity is sort of, within the specific calling, that you are living through, right? So, it's always sacrifice. Again, it's always cost. And I know I yammer on about this, but my concern about our sex positive moment is that it's a real big pretend that we can, lean in and have it all and blah, 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 blah. And it's just not true. It's just not true. and a Christianity
Well,
without
that
the
goes
cross
back
is
to what
absurd.
Nate was saying. That goes back to what Nate was saying though too. Is that I think in Laura, you and Sam were talking about the ideal, right? As if like there's one way of behaving, as if like that's the best thing, and everyone should strive toward that. And I'm not sure that I think that we should think of the ideal as a set of rules or behaviors rather than like the character of a person. And so we can say Jesus was the ideal man, but he came to fulfill a very specific purpose on this earth, and one of them was not procreation. And so therefore marriage wasn't a part of that. But that's not to say that none of us don't have that role, and for us to not fulfill that role would be less than ideal. And so we're actually not living up to the ideal if we're supposed to have kids and get married. And that's what God would have for us. And we refuse to do that because of some invented ideal that God didn't call us to.
One of the things that makes us Christian as opposed to Buddhist or something else is that is the way we have thought in Christian history about desire. Desire is not something in a Christian context to be extinguished. It's something to be trained and redirected and elevated. And whether you're
leveled up,
whether you are celibate or married, that is what your celibate calling or your married calling is supposed to do.
Right.
So either that happens through a romantic love that creates a deep connection to a single person that is elevated, or you are able to direct that longing directly toward God through the celibate life.
Well, it's kind of like if the thing that you're doing is properly oriented within the hierarchy, then it's good to do. And if you elevate that all the way to the top, then you've done something wrong. But then if you only look at the top and you don't look at all the things that need to orient toward it, then you're doing it wrong. And so like sex is a good thing, properly oriented within the hierarchy that God has created for us.
Okay.
Hey, so I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead,
guys,
Laura,
but
and then a
I have to go. But it sounds like
Okay.
Sam might be jumping in. So
okay.
cool.
Sam,
He can
Sam
replace me.
can jump
Okay.
in if he wants
We'll miss
to.
you, Laura.
Bye, Laura.
Share
Thanks
the link. He needs
thanks for
the link.
starting this conversation, by
Yeah,
the
it
way.
really
You and
is
Sam
awesome.
did such a great
Thanks,
job.
Laura.
Oh, and Nate, we should totally do a conversation about courtly love. Yay, it's Sam.
Let's
Hi,
do
Sam.
it. Yeah, let's do
All
it.
right, bye-bye.
So in terms of the title of the talk here, why is the church today so sex positive when the ancient church is so sex positive? Has the properly understood, has this been a correction in the history of the church? Or has there been correction in the history of the church?
I don't know. No, I don't know about
that. There's certainly been an alteration. I don't know if I would call that a corrective, but this is I was thinking about this question, Paul, this morning on my run, and I've been thinking a lot about carburetors lately, and if you follow my Twitter feed, you may have seen me talking about carburetors, and like they're amazing, right? There's this crazy technology that allows us to have engines that move our cars, et cetera, right? And I know we do fuel injectors now, but you get the basic idea that it's like a little bit of air and a little bit of gas, and it has to be properly calibrated. And if you're in high altitude, you have to calibrate it one way, and if it's in low altitude, you have to calibrate it another way. If you have too much gas shooting through there, you're gonna black out your spark plugs, et cetera, right? So it's this real delicate tension balance thing, and I want to argue that this question about sex positivity and sex negativity, falls into that category of, I don't think that there's a right answer in the way that like it's this, we can sort of create a recipe and it, if you do da 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 da, it's sort of this like spreadsheet, sort of thinking that because we're human beings, it's in a constant tension, right? And the reason, and then therefore, when you think about sex, I feel like conversations are difficult because we're trying to talk about sex in a vacuum, and certainly in the Christian context, we have to understand sex is happening in this dynamic tension between husband and wife, right? And every Tuesday is different, every Thursday is different, right? It's never the same. and so much of this tension, what was John talking about at the conference, this sort of to find the right grip. Remember, he was talking about this, that you're in this sort of ready position and you're constantly, finding that sweet spot that changes every day. And so I think like sometimes, if we want to talk about time in the church, sometimes it might call for a kind of sex negativity. And I think sometimes, maybe we've overcorrected that way and we could probably be a little bit more. But I think at the heart of it is a sort of a need for a deep respect for the power of sex.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's, it can possess you. It can make you do crazy things. Right. And therefore, as what Sam and Laura made me really take seriously is because I came out of this sort of very, post-conciliar sex positive theology of the body thing, which I still basically appreciate and believe in. But it made me rethink why the church at different times would be so, you might even say, respectful about the power of sex. And I wonder if we're losing that part of it.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Kale, because I can't remember where I read this, and it's been a long time. But the idea of some things are unclean, where women who are on their period are unclean,
mikvah baths and all that.
And that with Onan, right, that semen cannot be spilled on the ground, because those are the things that create life, and those are the things that belong to God, which is why. It's not that you're unclean as in those are dirty. Yeah. You're unclean because you touch something that is really holy, right? It's a different interpretation. But I think down through history, it's become, kind of the Freudian soiled or sordid variety of that, where we think of it as dirty in a.
Right, Michael. Whereas, you look at something like The Wife of Bath and Chaucer, it's like they're making all the same jokes that we make post-Freud, but they look at those jokes as sort of in my reading of it, sort of wonderfully sort of life affirming and like, isn't it kind of funny that we like do this weird thing and we kind of like it and babies happen? Like, wow, like this is crazy and funny, and it's actually really rather absurd. I mean.
Mm-hmm. But I think that your point, about how things change over time. I think that this it applies with this even to the image of the church. What we think of the church or whatever that happens to be, is that these things can either become idols or icons, right? Yeah. And sex is no different than the church or the Eucharist, and it can become an idol and it can become an icon. And if it's an idol, it reflects back your own desires. If it's an icon, it leads you to the transcendent. And that's in a way I would say that we have that job before us as Christians right now is in a way, because we see how sordid and how horrible, with things like OnlyFans and all these horrible things that are out there right now. This is in a way we're being told this is what you need to redeem. Right.
Well, we're the coupling of sex to love that happened in Christian culture is being undone before our eyes. Like we're watching it happen. So,
well, and then there's biological factors in there too that I think cannot be separated. For example, when we went through this, a lot of the evangelical churches have gone through the sex positivity thing, and so men, you can have all this and whatever. And we know that biologically speaking, men reach their sexual peak in terms of their desire at 25. Women tend to reach it at 35. So you have all these guys, 25-year-olds, but all of a sudden their drive starts decreasing. And they're at 35 and they're like, well, I don't even want to have sex anymore. But now my wife, who's like, wait a minute, why doesn't my husband like me? Isn't he attracted to me? Because my drive is higher and he's just not there. But then what does he feel he has to do in order to get his drive? And that's where, pornography, other things, or you have to do these other things to get me to that level.
Right.
And so removing sex from the context, I think is part of it's only positive within that context. And I feel like the Bible is fairly clear here. It's sex positive, like it's honey positive. It can be abused. Right. It can be really dysfunctional. And the Bible talks a lot about those dysfunctions as well.
Or wine. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, let's get Sam, you joined. Did you want to pass the baton to Sam and see what he has to say?
You're both wearing the blue shirts. It must be the uniform.
Uniform.
Sorry if it's a little loud in the background. The fruits of my procreative activity are making lots of noises at the moment. But I really enjoyed this discussion. I finally got caught up on like 2.5x. But I still really think that my point and my question still kind of stands. That I really do think that the early church was pretty sex negative. I do think also regarding Song of Solomon, I think we underestimate also how the early church viewed Judaism with a level of suspicion and negativity that we find uncomfortable now too. That's its whole other topic. And that they were really pretty anti-law. And so they could interpret Song of Songs allegorically while also saying that the kind of literal layer of Song of Solomon was perhaps not to be admired or followed. And that Origen was not unique in doing that either. It wasn't just invented by one guy. It was pretty consistent with the whole early church's hermeneutic of the Old Testament.
I mean, maybe, Sam, but my contention is that the early church fathers are reacting in a particular context and a particular culture. And so
I agree. Well, another thing that I also want to point out is I don't think that this sex ethic came from a bunch of stodgy old men who were celibates at the top of a monastery's hierarchy. I think that characterization, which Michael Martin was putting around, I think that really isn't true. I think that this was very bubble up from the bottom. And if anything, it was more female driven than male driven. And I think you can see things like the Acts of Paul and Thecla and other early Christian documents that were not written by some stodgy monastic like Jerome that reflected this. And that I think, if anything, the male-led hierarchy was playing catch up on a female grassroots-driven reaction against male sexuality in the Roman Empire. So I agree with you, Tripp, that there is a reaction going on, but I think that some characterization of this as some sort of, I don't know, collusion of angry celibate old men is just completely false. If I have to be completely honest.
No, it's still Neoplatonism as well. We didn't mention, but we mentioned Augustine a little bit. But I think you can't deny that the influence of Neoplatonism and the elevation of spirit over matter, there was a big part of this.
I agree with that, but the Acts of Paul of Thecla was written 200 years before Neoplatonism existed. So I like a lot of my focus was on the very early church, not even really the patristic period, but the ante-Nicene period. And I could defend my restorationism that Cale was asking about some other time. But I think that the idea that the early church, and really, I mean, like the first couple hundred years when they were a persecuted minority in the Roman Empire, was anti-sex and sex negative and valorizing of virginity to a degree that I still find kind of shocking.
Okay, let's have Michael give his
and
rebuttal.
that I still think is my point, but I appreciate that.
Let's hear
I
Michael's
think
rebuttal.
you're historically correct, Sam, but I still agree with Michael. Because I think the problem is like, let's not give, because it is early in the church, in the history of the church, let's not give it more weight than it necessarily deserves to get.
What?
Because that's not the right way to understand tradition. Like, it just isn't. Like, tradition cannot always be backward looking, and we can't just assume that because it was the early church, they necessarily had it right.
Well,
we have to just acknowledge the fact that, hey, maybe they were wrong, and I think we're wrong we're wrong in our own time for a whole bunch of reasons that probably won't be understood until well after us too, that we'll be completely blind to. But we just have to. I mean, we have to just deal with the fact that maybe we just have to say that, yeah, that's what the view was. I think it's unambiguously clear that was the view. But it's
even
incorrect.
If it wasn't necessarily wrong, but even if it's not necessarily wrong, sometimes it's incomplete, right? You're answering a different question than the one that we're asking, and we're just not aware that we're asking different questions. So, for instance, when the Pharisees go to Jesus and they ask him about divorce, he's like, no divorce except in the case of porneia, right? A sexual immorality of some kind. And he gives no caveats to that. That's the only reason, right? Paul later, he says,
Paul what? Tripp, Paul what?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Adds to it. He adds another caveat, right? He says, well, the Lord says this, not I. And then he says, I say, not the Lord, that if you're essentially he's making a kind of a carve out for Christian converts whose like spouses divorced and left them to be able to remarry, which was not something that Jesus was considering at the time that the Pharisees were asking him that question. And so I don't think it's contradictory, and nor do I think that Paul
right.
or
And
I
if
would.
If Paul has the audacity to modify Christ, then we should be able to modify what the position of the early church fathers
Of the
was.
patristics and the early church is based on the context. And so I think Paul is answering at that point a different question than the one Jesus was answering whenever he was asked about it, because he was being asked about men just casting off their wives because they weren't happy about them. And so he's like, screw that. No, she's been unfaithful. You cannot do that. And then Paul says, well, but now we're in this new period and we need to have some allowances for some other things while still respecting the high view of marriage that Jesus gave. So if Paul can do that with Jesus, and we're not going to say Jesus is wrong in the way that he answered it, obviously, we have to be able to say that the early church may need to be abrogated in some ways because they were reacting to different questions than the one that we're asking right now. That's my point.
Yep.
I don't know, Michael. Did you want to have?
No, I mean, I think you see it in Paul. I mean, who received a Greek education. There was this elevation. It goes back to Plato. You want to say you don't use the Neoplatonists. Go back to Plato, the elevation of the spirit over the body. It's just how it
I
is.
agree with you, Martin. I think that we underestimate how Hellenized that area of the world actually was. Like it was very, very. I mean, if you go to I went to Ephesus, and you can actually see like the different buildings and which ones were built by the Greeks and which ones were built by the Romans, just by archway. Like it's very, very Hellenized area of the world, and I think it's hard for us to understand that these weren't like this kind of enclave of Jews that never read Plato or anything. Like, no, they would have read it. It was like Alexander the Great did his job in spreading Greek culture throughout that part of the world.
That period in Jewish history seems to have been a period in which was in a sort of a sex negative mode compared to most of Jewish history. I was just actually reading an article yesterday on the Torah.com that was actually talking about like that period of the Second Temple period, which was actually much more like sex negative than later Judaism.
Well, and it wasn't just Christianity.
Marital relations are considered
right.
On Shabbat are now considered a mitzvah, but in that period it was discouraged.
But it wasn't just Christianity at that period that had that kind of, I wouldn't call it sex negativity. I would call it sexual hypocrisy negativity that you see actually in The Golden Ass by Apuleius, which is it's a wonderful book. But what happens is one of the adventures he has is with these temple eunuchs, these priests, and they're all perverts, right? And the story is his own initiation into the mysteries of Great Mother, of Isis, and then at the end he becomes a celibate priest in service of Isis. But he shows the same culture. I think he was an exact contemporary of Saint Augustine. I'm not sure. I can't remember. My dates might be off a little bit, but it's kind of interesting to see it. And we think that it was just Christianity that was doing this, having this resistance to this pornified culture, but it wasn't. So I guess
or it wasn't solely. Yeah, it wasn't solely.
There are allies out there, right?
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful book if you ever get a chance to read it. But I have to go. Somebody just called me. They have a swarm of bees they want me to come and catch.
Okay.
Go catch those bees.
It's the life. All right. Good. It was great talking to you guys. Take care.
Thanks for joining
Thanks,
Michael.
Okay.
All right. Now we are into a smaller group. So we've got 25 minutes left. Is there anything that y'all have wanted to go into and we've left unsaid? Have we been too theoretical? And Grim was.
Well, I guess
go ahead.
I would like to get Sam's take. I would like to get Sam's take on my contention that going back to like the very earliest church and the earliest writers is what we should be aiming for in terms of finding the most like the highest fidelity version of Christianity. I'd like to hear an argument for that, because I don't think that that's right. If we do that, I agree with you, Sam. We're going to have a lot of sex negativity in this, because like it's, you know, after the New Testament, like those patristic, like those early church fathers were very sex negative. Why do you think that that should be our aim?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I admit that I'm probably much more restorationist, especially than a Catholic or Orthodox person, and even more than a Puritan or a high church Protestant or even a CRC pastor would be in my hermeneutic or approach. But if I were to defend that idea, it would be that Jesus was a perfect revelation from God, and that the early church had some proximal closeness in time to that we don't. And that there's some, not right now, that there's some value in that, and that they have some witness to give us now because of their closeness in time to Jesus and his apostles and stuff like that. But I would also say that really my main point, I feel like I'm a little bit misunderstood, as I'm like already fully 100% on board of we need to adopt the early church sexual ethic. I'm more like, I was surprised that this was there. No one had ever taught me about this. Well, and there is some ignorance and incongruity with the way that most of the church I see talking about sex now is with regards to Christian history, and that there needs to be a more mature integration of Christian history with the way that we're talking about it now. And I don't have a bunch of clear answers on how to do that. But I think my main goal was to stimulate that idea and discussion.
You do bring up something really interesting right there, Sam, and the idea that it's very much different from the way the church now is talking about sex. Because most people in the church that are talking about sex are talking about it because it's positive, not because they know anything about it whatsoever. I found, and it's not just true of the church. This is true of like the entire first world culture. I've been in bars and churches and clubs where people have said, when I was a sex ed teacher, what do you think about this? And we get into conversations. These people are participating in things they have no idea what they're doing. They're acting very confidently about it because they think they ought to. But I think there is a big issue that when it comes to sex, sexuality, gender issues, and things like that, there's a large segment of the church that's speaking from huge empty spaces of ignorance. They haven't looked into it at all. They've only read books by their peers or people that already align with their preconceived notions, kind of Jonathan Haidt type. But there aren't a lot of people talking from like a desire to do the research and learn.
So I'm going to bring in some questions from the audience now. And Grim Grizz asks, Tantra, sexual, spiritual energy, and sex as active worship. This is something that on the video that I played or that I pointed to that sort of got this going in Preston Sprinkles, where you had the Old Testament scholar was like, hey, this sexual ecstasy as psychotechnology brings us to the gods, and Christianity's like, nope. And Judaism, nope. I mean, is that a big difference between pagan? And because I think there is very much, in terms of some new age communities now, sexual positivity is out there.
I would say it's anti-Christ. The whole big thing that Christ was revolutionary is that I'm not coming here to, be a victor in the normal sense, but I'm coming here to lay down my life and achieve victory that way. And to a certain degree, I take that same ethic and approach it to sex. I approach the sexual encounter in that same way. I am making myself available for somebody that I love, laying down myself for that. And so the idea of through achieving some kind of pleasure, we reach God, I just think that's very contrary to the whole ethic.
And again,
are you sure that's how someone who was practicing Tantra would describe what they're doing?
I can't assume that about everyone.
Because
I have spoken to several that do, and
well,
yeah,
I mean, maybe some like maybe that like some celebrity heartthrob might describe it that way or something. But I wonder how the practitioners think of it, because like one of the ways to think about Tantra is actually as a kenotic act. So I'm not.
All right.
I'm not so sure I would just like. I'm not endorsing it either, but I'm not so quick.
Yeah, but
to
for
say
who?
just,
I mean, canonic for who?
It depends on what you're into. Like for a married couple, like I don't think it's necessarily like the idea of entering into that union in such a way that you're trying to like remove as much of yourself as possible to be in that moment of union. I don't think that's a bad thing, and that's definitely not Antichrist. I'll definitely say that.
I would say the approach is, though, because it's subtle, and it's not because the idea of Christ is everything. The people that I love are more important to myself, always, and so even in a marriage,
right? And that's what Tantra's trying to do. You were attempting to give yourself entirely, physically and spiritually, to your partner. That's
not entirely. See,
I don't think
it's complete. It's sport. It's not self-sacrificial love open toward the unitive and procreative. There, I'm going to dump my Catholic stuff right on you. It's also completely absurd, right? I mean, if you're like 25 and 24 and you don't have kids, like fine, go spend all Saturday afternoon having 9-hour tantric sex. But like married people live in the real world, not in like tantric sex world. Like,
and socioeconomically, there's an aspect of it too.
Right. I mean, it's absurd. Like, what about work? Like, how are you fitting in these 9-hour sessions? It's just, I don't know. I just think it's dumb. It's selfish. I think it's selfish.
Isn't the general idea that it's the ecstasy of the pleasure that gives you access to some sort of spiritual experience that is sort of some kind of psychotechnology? I think it's very similar to the psychedelic question.
Yep.
Yeah,
right?
That's why I just said
Christians have access to the true thing, not via psychedelics, and I think the tantric thing is some sort of similar attempt at shortcutting.
I mean, I would love to hear, like the journal of, a 75-year-old former tantric practitioner. Like, I really would. Like, what would that be like? So when you're in your hot, racy 20s and 30s and you're like having tantric sex, what wisdom did you derive, when you're 80 years old? Like, I mean, talk about two speeds.
All right.
Well, yeah, but there's something about you're talking about. So I think what everybody's talking about here is some like California version of tantric sex, completely removed from its cultural context and practiced by Westerners.
All right.
That's not what I'm trying to say. We shouldn't be so quick to rush to judgment.
Nate is speaking for the purists. I'm going to go back to the Christian realm. And Matsy has a question. Is Christ's devotion to the church a kind of chivalric love?
Yes. Yes. 100%.
All right.
That's why chivalry still matters. That's why it's an enduring cultural meme, because it is actually how we're supposed to be Christians in the world. And I don't mean like knights in armor and that kind of shit. I mean, the ideals of chivalry are self-sacrifice to protect the innocent and the vulnerable.
Right. And the kind of like chivalric or courtly love, it's supposed to also be morally elevating to all involved, right? So I think that's the difference between lust and what we're talking about whenever we say sex positivity, right? It's morally elevating. It's not the D&D you're deducting points kind of thing, right? It's not that.
All right, I have dropped the link in the comments, so we'll see if anyone wants to come in here and correct us. Grim wasn't real happy with most of the answers. Nate sort of stuck up for him. Here's another question: how can Christ suffer in every way like us and yet die a virgin?
You can't suffer after you're a virgin. After you're no longer a virgin.
I was gonna say, what is a virgin suffering that we're not. I feel like actually that's an additional.
And
suffering
Hebrews says Jesus was tempted in every way like we are. It doesn't say he suffered in every way like we are.
That's right. I've had to suffer with Jacob for a long time, and Jesus never had to suffer with Jacob. So go ahead. Sorry, I love you, Jacob. Just throwing that in. Okay, Chad, you got a question or you got a comment?
Yeah, no, like the question I have is about so there's a couple teachers, well there were a couple, but I was wondering what are some practical explanations you might be able to give or practical practice or something or good reason to like a secular, maybe nominal Christian around the importance of both sex and abstinence, maybe. And I have my thoughts on this, but I'm wondering what you guys think, because like I've had experience on the extreme of both, I think. So I'm wondering.
Can you the extreme of both what, Chad? I'm sorry. Can you?
Promiscuity, and then making a decision about trying abstinence and really giving that a shot, and how I might be able to walk with that, and why I would. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I think so. I've done this before when I was teaching sex ed with kids and adults. But the idea of like abstaining to a certain degree, I mean, it's kind of like fasting. Your appetites, whether it be for food or sex, all your drives, they can blur your vision. And so by purposefully abstaining, you allow yourself to see things more clearly. For example, I had so many friends that were female that would introduce me as their gay friend or a family member because they didn't know how to explain to other people that I was a guy not interested in having sex with them. Right. They didn't even it was beyond their comprehension. Yeah. But by me having that position of the guy not trying to have sex with them, it allowed me to get to know them, it allowed them to get to know me, and allowed even more Christian influence in their lives.
Which I think is a weird sort of caveat to the sort of the story of Jerome that you invoked last talk, Paul. I mean, Jerome was famous for how many female friends he had. You know, for all of his cantankerousness and his misogyny, he was like a great friend of women. And I think in that sense, right, he was not trying to sleep with them. And, you know, there's a sort of a real gift of self that frankly, taking sort of the genital potential component off the table, it actually affords friendship and knowledge that is so important. And that came up earlier when we were talking about we only understand relationships now sexually, you know, like, and I think that is part of what we've lost in this sex positive boost in the last, you know, whatever 100 years, but really intensely in the last 30 to 40, is that friendship has been the great sacrifice. We don't know how to talk about that, and that's a real devastating blow, I think.
Well, yeah,
I
when we
might
keep
be
talking about
a victim of.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, when we keep talking about the idea of telling a better story, I really believe that this is the thread that should be leaned into. Why would I be abstinent? What is so important about being a friend? And I think if so, like on my side of things, the damage that I have done, and the self-deceit, and listening to, you know, the culture and just kind of running around willy-nilly. Yeah. You don't understand the kind of damage until maybe it might be too late, and you really have to wrestle with what it is that you've done. So that's why I think it's important to, you know, it's not a virtue. I mean, it's not just virtuous. It's like, you know, like there's like you end up hurting people that you'll never even know. Wow. And you affect the world in ways that you can't even begin to imagine unless you like hopefully we wake up to some of that stuff. So I think the idea or the thread of friendship and why is important before even hold hands is important and not corny. And so how do you tell that story so that it's a better story? Okay, I got to go. Thank you guys. Great
I want to bring
conversation.
Joseph in here because I would have really liked to have gotten someone with a lot of a good Jewish voice in here. Thought about Jacob, but that would have been difficult. So Joseph, I'm really glad you showed up. And then he's gone.
Man, he's like, he got
no.
mission complete. I showed up, and
he was wrestling with his camera so hard. It's
I know. Right while he was driving, I hope he seemed to have stopped the car. So, oh, look at that, Michael. Welcome. Did you have a question while Joseph figures this stuff out?
Well, I kind of wanted to come in a little bit of the defense of the John Piper-ism,
Yeah, Trip didn't really bring the Puritan thunder like he was supposed to.
Well, there's a lot of people in this call, so I'm trying not to.
Okay.
I'm trying not to do what I did to Sam, where I just talked the whole time.
Okay, Go ahead, Michael.
Well, so I grew up with I had the Joshua Harris book, and I gave a speech to my homeschool group about dating with integrity, and I did all the right stuff, but the thing that really I read Tim Keller's book Counterfeit Gods, and he talked about Jacob and Rachel, and how it was an idolatrous fascination with and I'm reading this and I'm like, oh wow, I thought that was like a romantic story, and I realized that this was my idolatry, the thing of God is most satisfied, most glorified in us when we're most satisfied in Him. That's why I said, okay, if God wants me to be single for the rest of my life, then that is the best possible life I could have. And I basically had to say that to myself and pray it for about a year until I really was content with that. And then things changed, and God said, no, you're supposed to get married. And then I found out that marriage is more of a sacrificial lifestyle in many ways than being single is. Just to not take more time, but even though my wife and I we waited until our wedding, we both still had baggage that we had to deal with because of this stuff, because a lot of what I had thought about sex was informed by pornography, and she had a lot of shame from people saying sex is dirty or whatever. So, this stuff and I think that, this society that we live in actually does afford a lot more honest conversation about that stuff. And other people are going to have a lot more baggage that they have to deal with. So the simple explanations of, kind of sweeping the conversation under the rug is not really a solution going forward.
Anybody, any comments on Michael's comment?
I mean, I think that's just the inverse, right? I think you're right, Michael. That sex is powerful, and all of us, in our respective standpoints and our respective histories, can witness to the power of it. And I think being serious about its seriousness is important, and that's why I think sometimes sex negativity, and I know I'm going to upset some of my reformed trad friends, it's sometimes you have to respect the power of the thing, right. Really. I don't want to come across. I'm even hearing the voices of be sex positive, Gail, be sex positive, because but I don't know. I just think we don't respect it in a weird sort of way, even though we talk about it all the time and we see it all the time. We don't respect it.
Well, it's equally parts powerful and dangerous. And so it's both it would be blasphemous to actually say that something that we were commanded to do that we were created to feel good about doing, that we were created to have a desire to do, is something that we should not do and we should like feel bad about, and it's a necessary evil. That is blasphemous. That's a blasphemous position. That's not good. That actually like defames God. That is not a good position. However, it is also one of the most dangerous things that God gave us to do. And we need to take that seriously. And that's why it's to be confined within certain boundaries, not just centered around certain things, confined to them. And so that's where the centered and bounded distinction. It's not just like, oh, the Christian, like the Christian monogamous marriage with kids is the ideal. It's to be bounded between a man and a woman in a monogamous marriage for that reason, not just centered around it. And that's where I would disagree with like Andrew Clavin or someone like that, who is kind of more, open to the gay marriage. I disagree. It's to be bounded there, not centered there. And it's a very dangerous thing, but it would be blasphemous for us to say that, oh, this thing that God commanded us to do, that he created us to feel good about and all this kind of things, that actually does like scientifically bring men and women closer together. Like you release oxytocin that like actually makes you like want to be with that person and trust that person more. We're designed to do this. It would be blasphemous to say God created that as a necessary evil. Absolutely not. I will not stand. That's where my Puritan thunder will come in. No, that is a blasphemous position.
All right, we've heard the Puritan thunder. I want to give Yosef.
There
He's
you go.
got his camera. I let Jacob in the room. The Hebrew thunder is here. Yosef, I'm going to give you privacy.
Hopefully you can hear me now. So yeah, I mean, I have so many thoughts. I'm not even sure like exactly where to begin or like what to address first and all this, because I mean, obviously it's a massively different story for us, even though we have a big chunk of the same Bible in theory. So I guess one of the first things I wanted to do is come in. So Nate talked about the article he read yesterday. He sent that to me as well, and I think that we have to really complicate the story a lot more. Because in the Second Temple period, yes, there was more sex negativity, but it was within specific sects within Judaism, right? So specific groups, it's going to be very confusing, we call it sex and sex. Groups and denominations of Jews, some of them, I would say, under kind of internal influences. We see this kind of potentially with the Therapeutae in Egypt, who are seemingly a monastic single-gender cult. We see this maybe in some of the descriptions of Essenes, though of course in Qumran it turned out that they're buried in family groups, so it doesn't really match the description we had in Josephus. But there may have also, Josephus probably is right about there must have been some groups that were similar to these guys who were maybe not celibate or something. And then even within the Pharisees, like there is an active conversation around this area. It's not that there's like one position, because like Jews agreeing with each other doesn't exist. But like you have some pretty major rabbis into the 2nd century who are held up, and not as ideals, but like they're people who basically, they would go off and study for years in the yeshiva and then come back intermittently. They'd be married, but they'd come back intermittently to have relations. And there's like this whole question of like, is that allowed? Is it okay if your wife gives you permission to do that? But they're always married, and they're never fully celibate marriages. There's always something acknowledged that would be problematic, because mostly the command to procreate. But also, more important than the command to procreate is something that I don't see in this conversation, which is, so we derive for marriage basically that husbands have 3 things that they owe their wives that are part of the marriage contract. And this is derived from an Exodus, when you can, the rules around taking a maidservant as a wife. And it says, if you don't want her, you still owe her these 3 things, which implies that you would have owed them to her if you married her. And one of those things is sex. And it's not about kids or procreation. It's just like, this is a right that the wife has. And that's how the rabbis read it. And then there's this entire discussion about like, okay, different people, either, let's say, men have this obligation to their wives have this right. And then like how often does that have to be fulfilled? And there's this whole question, and it's dependent on your job is kind of the main frame. So if you have jobs that you're away a long time, let's say you're staying.
Uh-oh.
I wanted more.
Wow, he's just getting to the good part.
Yeah.
Well, the only reason I jumped in was Yosef looked like he was dropping out. So,
Thank you, Jacob.
so I guess I'm here in Rabbi Yosef's stead. Obviously, there's a lot to say, and I think actually the answer to your question, why is the church today so sex positive when the ancient church was so sex negative? Like I commented before on the other video, I think it's obvious because now the church actually pays attention to the Hebrew Bible, whereas for thousands of years they thought it was worthless. And
big statement.
Really?
That's a big statement.
Really?
Yes.
No.
And the Code of Jewish Law is kind of like a catechism for Judaism. It has 4 sections. One of the sections is about marriage, and this is the first paragraph of that section from about marriage. Every man is required to marry a woman in order to be fruitful and multiply. Anyone who's not occupied with being fruitful and multiplying is like a murderer and reduces the visage of God and causes the Holy Spirit to flee from Israel. Anyone who does not have a wife is steeped in being without blessings and without the Torah, etc., and is not considered a human being. And when he marries, his sins are released, as it is said, Proverbs 18:22, he who finds a wife finds goodness and releases the will of the Lord. There is a very real sense in Orthodox Judaism, and for somebody who has not been married, this was a very difficult thing for me, but I don't change Judaism because it's not a comfortable thing for me, is that a human being, Genesis 1:27, a human being reflects the image of God in being male and female. And I think that's something Christians cannot say because Jesus is supposed to be the perfect human being. And he obviously wasn't female. And that's why, I mean, I have had Catholics and Eastern Orthodox tell me, well, Jesus was married to Mary. And the people have said this, and
no, I'm not disagreeing that people have said that to you. I'm just saying that that's just shite theology.
I agree with you, but it's the type of gymnastics you end up doing when you have to.
Well, it sounds weird, but it's symbolically necessary, Cale.
Exactly.
I would agree with those Christians.
It's symbolically necessary.
That's precisely why she has to be perpetually virgin, which I would, with my disagreement with Michael, like, that's
and look, Anselman is saying God is not male and female. I mean, this is supposedly a sola scriptura Protestant. Like, what do you do with Genesis 1:27 if you don't have it? What do you do with that when Jesus is supposed to be the embodiment of God? And he fails quite easily in that.
But he's not the embodiment of God. I mean, I do not want to get into
this is like
Trinitarian
theologically
stuff.
confused.
This is going to be an absolute disaster.
Trinitarian theology. We'd have a whole nother
I was just told
conversation.
last weekend that the Cistercians forbade anybody preaching on the Trinity for like 100 years because it's anyway.
No
sorry,
more talking
sorry,
about the Trinity until we figure out
sorry.
what the hell's going on. Yes.
That's right,
Okay,
that's right, that's right.
and Yosef has his connection back. So Yosef, Jacob has just been speaking for you. You see, it was very effective. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yosef was in the middle of explaining to us why it's good to be married to a Jew. But please continue.
I don't know where it got cut off, but like I'm sure Jacob did it fine. I trust him.
Wow.
You cut off whenever you were saying that if the guy like was returning to his wife.
The 3 requirements.
Oh, the 3 requirements.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, it's just it's a fundamentally different. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure Jacob said it's just a fundamentally different framing, right? We do see it as very sex positive, but not in the same way you guys are using sex positive. Maybe. Like for instance, I could talk about being sex positive, but at the same time, as an Orthodox Jew who dated and is married, like I did not physically touch my wife when she was my girlfriend or my fiance. We never held hands, we never kissed, like no touching at all, not intimate touch, like none, until we were married. Like, and that's normal. Not only did I not touch her, but we weren't even in a room by ourselves together.
Wow.
Okay, like
you
so
dating goodbye.
It's a completely different, all those articles when Mike Pence said he wouldn't have like dinner with a woman. So that's actually okay because in public it's okay as long as there's people around to make sure you're not doing anything problematic. But for us, like, yeah, doing that, like, we were kind of laughing because like that's a rabbinic thing, but it comes, I mean, it was certainly around the time of Jesus. And it was said that it was instituted initially by King David after the rape of Tamar. So there's some interesting kind of, I would say, it's a combination, right? You have the kind of the sex positivity, let's say, ish, but in this weird way of the Bible, but there's also a lot of like accumulated wisdom, and I would say the rabbinic corpus around this. And that should be as much part of this conversation as Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and Roman, going overboard. Because there were other options around. It wasn't that those were the only options. Was either you're Roman and sex crazy, or like you were going to be kind of this, I don't know, aesthetic sort of Gnostic that like, or at least Neoplatonic, away from the body, is all bad. There were other paths available. And especially for people who were living in Judea, they would have known some of those paths. I mean, there probably were other paths outside of this region, but even in this region, we for sure know there were other paths that they could have taken.
Yeah.
And I think Sam's point was really good. That the early church is as much a reaction against Roman sex positivity, or not sex, Roman sex whateverness.
It's, I would call it sex casualness. Like there's a casualness toward sex that
casualness, but also as an exercise of power,
tyranny, almost. Yeah.
And Joseph, like I'm hearing you talk. I remember reading, of all things, like a Naomi Wolf. This was like in the 90s. Naomi Wolf wrote something, about her Orthodox Jewish best friend. And she had sort of spent some time as a sort of a non-practicing Jew, and then had kind of reverted back to sort of her upbringing. And she talks about the way in which, so she went then through the process that you're talking about in terms of that dating and that kind of real, I would just call that like a hyper respectful, respective of the power of sexuality, between the sexes. And she talks about how incredible she, as a secular person, looked at her friend who would only, everything was reserved for she and her husband in this like hyper private way, even physical touching, hair, like all of those kinds of things. And to me, it's a vision of deep respect for the thing, not negative or positive, right? Something like that. Maybe that's a way to sort of save the frame here, that it's, that what I see projected in the scriptures, both the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, is a sense that this is something that has to be really gardened, and I'm kind of deliberately using that enclosed metaphor on purpose, that it's like, it's not casual, it's not nothing, it's a lot.
It's a lot, and so like I was just reading Malachi 2, and he talks about man and wife. Did he not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And what was the one God seeking? Godly offspring. So it's not just a negative, like there's a portion of the Spirit in the union of a man and wife. This is a positive thing for the purposes of procreation. This is something God created. And yeah, I mean, to the extent that I don't think there's any way of reading the Old Testament for sure in a sex negative way. And I think the early Christians were reacting against the Greco-Roman kind of tyrannical sexual ethic of the time. And that's why we read them. Yeah.
But that's also what I wanted to stress, and what Sam said when he first came on, which was they're reacting to the Greco-Roman thing. They're also reacting to Jews. They're also part of the
Can you say more about that? Can you say more
Well,
about that?
For sure, because I think part of the, especially the anti-Pharisaism that comes out in the early 2nd century, and even maybe the late 1st century, but the Pharisees really aren't the dominant party until after the temple is destroyed, and maybe 15, 20 years later. So maybe around the time that, or at least for me, Luke and Acts is being written, and I find Luke Acts is really interesting because of all the Gospels, it's the most pro-Pharisee, which is kind of interesting. But the Pharisees by then are coming out as like the dominant force. But it's not just the Pharisees; it's a group. It's only one group within them. Like we would say, the proto-rabbis or the rabbis at that point, really. But by then, Christianity and Judaism are not. I mean, they are seeing each other as much more heretical, right? And they're pushing each other away. And in part of pushing each other away, they're kind of almost being allergic to each other. So part of it is like we want to go even. To use another comparison, like Islam,
I'm going to be the most anti.
We're going to be the most.
Ever.
We're going to be the most.
Yeah.
So
Right.
for
So
Islam, Jews on Yom Kippur daven 5 times a day, and the rest of the year we daven 3 times a day. Well, we're going to daven 5 times. Pray 5 times a day because that's the most.
So this is the opponent processing thing that Paul was bringing up in the former conversation between the Catholics and the Protestants, sort of the Eastern Orthodox sort of doing their own thing over here, not being opponent processed. But is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, I think
like
so.
That?
I think, well, no, I think that, like, Joseph, I think you're right. And Jacob, I think he maybe made the point in a little bit of an extreme manner, but there's something here.
Never.
Like I don't think it's incidental that the two things that I would say the early church got most wrong is how extremely sex negative it was and how supersessionist it was. I think that those things are not disconnected.
Well, yeah. I mean, I would agree with you. I think you probably are going onto very dangerous territory. I mean, this is what my comments in the chat were. Like, if the early church fathers could get this wrong, or that Paul could abrogate Jesus, or using any of that sort of language, then what else is wrong, or could be abrogated, or did they get wrong, or was contextual, or was part of this opponent processing that was still coming out and still needs to be worked out? How far do you go?
But with the oral tradition and the I mean, we can go with that in the Jewish tradition as well. Like,
sure.
So
I think it's a little.
We can ask that question, but like that's just we're a tradition. Right, Judaism has its own kind of branch, and then Christianity forks off of it, and we all have our own traditions. So yeah, we can ask that question, but we're all answering the questions that were asked in the context in which we're asked them, and we have to apply those, appropriately. And so, I'm not going to go to you and be like, justify the Canaanite, genocide or whatever. Like these were all contextual, and we have to understand those stories and those questions in the context in which they're written. And I have no problem with saying that, like, yeah, Paul was answering a different question than Jesus was answering, and that's fine.
And I think also we have to understand a living tradition. A living tradition is shaped by its final cause in an Aristotelian sense, right? It's not just it's not only determined by what has gone before. Otherwise, it is dead. It's actually dead. This is actually what's at the core of the distinction that Paul is trying to make between traditions of men and a living tradition which is of God. Because a living tradition that is of God is directed and pulled by that final cause, which is out in the eschatological future. And we can't ever look back at any point in the past and say that's it and it's fixed. We have to be able to amend and repair it in real time.
I obviously agree on the living tradition point. Like, we have a living tradition too. I don't agree that the final cause is static. This telos is static. I think I'm not Aristotelian.
I didn't say that it was.
But it sounds like it's a very fixed eschatology. That's like we're going to there is going to be an end point. In how you describe.
Yeah, as a Calvinist, there is. Yes.
Go ahead, Jacob.
No, I don't actually. I believe in the spiral. So we can talk about that later. But no, I don't. No.
And
I think epicausis is definitely part of the eschatology for me.
And we're past our 2 hours.
So part of the reason I actually thought it was good that this conversation was pretty much had among Christians, it is that this is really, really important and complex stuff. And there is a reason why Jewish stuff kept on coming up and everybody kept on saying, where's Joseph and where's Jacob? Because I think Christianity is, in fact, looking towards Judaism in ways that it was not before, in order to help itself define itself. And there's a reason why so many things were going off on so many tangents and it's going so far. Because this is something fundamental enough that questions of canonicity, like we were talking about in the chat, questions of symbolism, and yes, the Trinity, questions there's of tradition and final cause and eschatology, right? This goes into the fundamental questions of everything that religion and life is about. And so trying to have this discussion too comprehensively is just frankly impossible. And I think that's part of what the synod this weekend is going to find out.
The synod, the Christian Reformed Synod.
Yeah.
All right. Does Jacob get the last word? Does anybody else want to say something? Jacob has the last word. Isn't that amazing?
It was a good last word.
Kel, you haven't said anything in a while. Do you have anything to say?
This is great. No, I've been just enjoying myself. This is fun.
So I want to thank both the people that were on the stream before. I know Joey early on was, there's too many cooks. And I thought, I kind of liked having a lot of cooks on this one. The purpose of this live stream for me was to hear from a bunch of voices, because the previous video with Sam and Laura and I clearly uncorked a whole bunch of things. Oh, Nathan, you're coming in just as I'm saying goodbye. You couldn't stand Jacob having the last word?
Well, sorry. I just wanted to hop on real quick. It seems like much of this discussion has happened among people who are already past making a decision about this. And so
the cakes have been baked.
Yeah. And so as a younger person who is very much facing this decision, the stream has been a little frustrating, to be honest, I guess, because it's inconclusive. But I guess a few years ago, I would have assumed the default that, yes, of course, you should pursue a family. But being in the Orthodox Church, our catechesis is pretty clear that celibacy is the higher good. And so now I very much am contemplating that question. And I think a missing part from this too has also been having a spiritual father that is supposed to guide you through this, and that you turn to and consult with, who helps you make that decision for whether or not that you're fitted for that. So it's not a one size fits all kind of thing.
All right. Well, maybe I'll have to have a youth stream. And, Vivian was just, she's just going crazy in the live chat about all sorts of stuff. So maybe, but she doesn't show up. That's the thing. You can troll in the live chat, but if you don't turn on the camera and come on the screen, you're not really part of the record. So anyway, so thank you, Nathan. Thank you for coming in, and thank you for all of you who have participated. This has been wild. I've learned a ton. And I've enjoyed it a lot. And this is a lot of why I've always wanted to do this. So I'm going to end the transmission now.